Marvel convinces you the universe is resilient, but its constant resets reveal a fragile system terrified of permanent consequences.
Not cities. Not timelines. Not the people who were supposed to be gone. And for a long time, audiences accepted that as part of the deal. A feature, not a flaw. That's where the first problem lives. Because here's the question nobody wanted to sit with. If the universe can always be reset, if the snap can be undone, if the multiverse always provides an exit, what exactly was ever at stake? That's not a narrative complaint. That's a structural diagnosis. And structural diagnoses don't care about your favorite hero. Because a system that cannot allow permanent failure is not resilient. It's fragile. And it's been hiding that fragility behind spectacle for decades. The spectacle was the cover story.
The Marvel Universe, both in comics and the MCU, was built on a specific promise: that heroism works, that the right people with the right power, operating within the right institutions, can hold the line. S.H.I.E.L.D. maintains order. The Avengers respond to threats too large for governments. The X-Men protect a world that hates them. Each layer of that structure reinforces the same core belief: the system is load-bearing. Remove one piece, and something else catches the weight. That belief wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Engineered beliefs don't survive contact with their own architecture. Marvel's institutional mythology needed audiences and in-universe civilians to trust that someone was always in control. Tony Stark builds suits to eliminate threats before governments have to act. Nick Fury runs a shadow intelligence network to anticipate catastrophe. The Sorcerer Supreme monitors dimensional boundaries so reality itself doesn't unravel. These aren't just characters, they're architectural supports. And the architecture served everyone who depended on it. Governments could defer. Civilians could feel protected. Villains could be categorized as anomalies rather than symptoms. The system's existence justified itself. But systems that justify their own existence rarely admit what they're built on. Here's what it was actually built on: the guarantee of recovery. Not prevention, not accountability. Recovery. The implicit promise that no matter how catastrophic the event, Thanos, Hydra's infiltration, the Scarlet Witch rewriting reality, the universe would correct itself. Someone would fix it. And because that remained true, no one had to interrogate whether the system itself was the problem. That's not stability. That's a standing exemption.
The cracks in that architecture aren't hard to find once you know where to look. Start with the Sokovia Accords. After years of Avenger operations that leveled cities and destabilized governments, the world demanded oversight. That was the reasonable response to structural failure. But what happened next revealed everything. The heroes fractured. Not over the Accords themselves, over who got to decide. Tony Stark wanted institutional accountability. Steve Rogers wanted individual moral authority. Neither position was wrong. That was the point. The system had never resolved that tension. It had just deferred it. And deferred tension doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Now, someone will argue that the Avengers' fracture was a character conflict, personal, psychological, situational, not structural. That's a comfortable reading. It's also incomplete. Character conflict doesn't explain why S.H.I.E.L.D.,
the most resource-rich intelligence organization in the MCU, was compromised at its foundation by Hydra for decades. Character conflict doesn't explain why the most powerful safeguard against multiversal collapse, the Time Variance Authority, turned out to be a tool of authoritarian timeline pruning. These aren't isolated failures. They're the same failure wearing different faces. Same failure, different institutional costume. The institutions Marvel built to contain power were themselves expressions of uncontained power. Every time the universe reset, every time a snap was reversed, every time a mutant was resurrected, the system was telling you something. Not that it was strong enough to survive, that it was too afraid to let anything permanently break. Because permanent breaks require permanent accountability, and accountability threatens the institution's legitimacy. That's the part the reset was designed to erase. That dynamic has a real-world analog. It looks like a financial system that privatizes gains and socializes losses. It looks like an infrastructure that gets emergency funding after the collapse rather than maintenance before it. The catastrophe is allowed. The structural reckoning is not.
Here's where it gets more specific. The individuals holding Marvel's system together weren't just powerful. They were exhausted. And exhaustion, at a certain level of responsibility, doesn't produce better decisions. It produces the illusion of control, maintained by increasingly fragile willpower. Fragile willpower at institutional scale is just a slower collapse. Tony Stark built Ultron because he was afraid. He framed it as strategic foresight. It was fear. The fear of a man who had stared at the void through a wormhole and decided the only way to protect everyone was to never let the threat get close enough to matter. That's not heroism. That's trauma institutionalized as policy. And trauma, when it sits at the center of a system, becomes the system's blind spot. Steve Rogers' absolutism operated the same way. His certainty that he knew right from wrong better than any committee, any government, any oversight body, wasn't arrogance for its own sake. It was a psychological coping mechanism for a man who woke up in a world where every anchor he had was gone. Moral clarity became his replacement for belonging. Neither of these men were broken. They were human. But the system placed them in positions where their humanity, their fear, their grief, their identity crises, had institutional consequences. When a single person's psychological state determines the structural integrity of a global defense network, you don't have a defense network. You have a dependency. Dependencies don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, then all at once. That's not a flaw in the character design. That's the flaw the system was always hiding.
After enough fractures, the architecture does shift. It doesn't disappear. It reorganizes around whoever survives with the most remaining legitimacy. In the comics, that's produced cycles. The Illuminati operating in secret, making unilateral decisions about planetary survival because the public couldn't be trusted with the information. The X-Men cycling between persecution and temporary alliance with governments that would turn on them again. The Fantastic Four functioning as explorers of structural chaos rather than agents of stability. Power doesn't disappear when institutions fail. It migrates. And it migrates toward whoever controls the next myth. In the MCU, the post-Endgame landscape told you exactly what the reorganization looked like. The Avengers as a formal structure effectively dissolved. No command hierarchy. No clear institutional authority. What emerged instead was a collection of individuals operating with enormous power and almost no accountability architecture at all. Wanda Maximoff rewrote a town. Sam Wilson was handed a shield with no infrastructure behind it. The multiverse cracked open, and the response was improvised. The myth of the safety net didn't disappear. It just became harder to locate. And symbols without location are the most dangerous kind. because they still produce public faith without providing actual structural support. Public faith without structural support is just managed exposure to risk. The old system cannot fully return. Not because the characters are gone, most of them aren't. Because the conditions that made the original architecture feel stable were always provisional. They were held together by belief. And belief, once it understands its own mechanics, can't quite go back to being belief.
So here's the question worth sitting with. Was Marvel's universe fragile because of the villains? Because of poor institutional design? Because of character failures at critical moments? Or was it fragile because it was never actually built to handle permanent consequences? Every reset, every resurrection, every timeline correction functioned as a form of institutional denial. The message was consistent. We can absorb any shock. The system holds. And that message required the system to never let anything actually break all the way, which means the system was never actually tested. Not really. Untested systems don't know their own load limit. You can't claim resilience if you've eliminated the conditions under which failure becomes permanent. This is the ideological core of what Marvel's safety net was selling. A vision of power that is simultaneously high stakes and ultimately consequence-free, where the snap can happen and be undone, where the multiverse fractures and gets patched, where death is a plot condition rather than an architectural one. That's not a criticism of storytelling. It's an observation about what the storytelling was designed to protect: the institution, the myth, the faith that someone, somewhere has this under control. That faith was the product. The stories were the delivery mechanism. The collapse was never caused by a single villain or a single failure. It was exposed repeatedly by a system that prioritized its own continuity over honest accounting. Resilience isn't proven by surviving catastrophe. It's proven by surviving the truth of what caused it. Marvel's universe keeps surviving the catastrophes. It's never quite survived the truth. A system that resets itself to avoid reckoning isn't safe. It's postponed. And postponed collapse is still collapse. It just arrives on someone else's watch.